Okay.
Yeah, I think we can get started. So hello everyone, welcome to Ask Seminar Series. This is the last seminar in the spring, and we will resume our seminars in the fall semester. And today the seminar is special. We have dual speakers, and our director, Naz Peter, also joined us. He is joining us from Swiss, and he will do the introduction. So very excited. And just so you know that this seminar will be recorded, and we will post the recording on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to stay tuned. And after the presentation, we'll have the Q&A. So feel free to bring up any questions you may have. And for the online attendees, if you can ask a question by unmuting yourself, or if you don't have a mic, you can chat other questions and we will read them out. So before the speaker gets started, I'm going to hand this to our director, Naz Peter, to introduce the speaker. So Naz, please go ahead from Swiss.
Thanks very much, and good evening from Geneva, and welcome to Talia and Julia, who I can't see, but I hope they're there, and I'll see them. There's Tyler, there is Julia. Hello there. So this is a seminar that came about because I happened to be introduced to Tyler at the AMS meeting in New Orleans, and we got to talking about greenhouse gas monitoring, which we come at. We have a joint interest, but we come at it from completely opposite ends of the scale. So that led to several conversations over the months from then until now, and it led to a visit to NIST up in Gaithersburg, where I met Julia and some of the colleagues, and they offered to come down here to Essig and talk to us about this. So this is great. Unfortunately, I can't be there, but I will be at the seminar, listen in. I have a hard cut off at 2 p.m. There is a lot going on right now with the NOAA CSAS funding, and that is keeping me extremely busy. And I know there's a lot going on at NIST also, so we were in doubt until very recently about whether this seminar would even happen. But it's great to see you there. So it's a two-part thing. Julia, who is a biologist and working on solar-induced fluorescence and on the CO2 at the urban scale, at the very local scale, and what we can learn from observations and models and mismatches of that. So Julia is a biologist, and she has her PhD, her bachelor, sorry, from Barnard, a master's from City University of New York, and a PhD from BU, and is a relatively recent hire at NIST. I think you just passed your year, did you not?
Indeed, hit the milestone.
So is now working on this local scale CO2 and SIF stuff at NIST, and will be talking to us about that. Tyler is from Maryland, actually, or from the University of Maryland, and got his bachelor's in atmospheric and oceanic science, and won a prize in climate science as well. And what Tyler is working on is something that is near and dear to my heart, is to put us in a position to do in situ measurements of CO2 concentrations at an accuracy that is good enough that we can actually talk about it in a greenhouse gas monitoring context, and is also inexpensive enough and autonomous enough, hopefully, that we can talk about it in the context of really a global observing system. And those two ends currently do not meet. And this is one of the reasons why we tend to have good greenhouse gas measurement, or reasonably good greenhouse gas measurement capabilities in places like North America, East Asia, and Western Europe, and really not very much else in pretty much the rest of the world. So I look forward to hearing about this, and I'm going to stop talking now and over to you. And I think, Julia, you're up first.
I'm up first.
Well, thank you, Lars Peter, for the introduction. We really appreciate it. And we're very excited to be here today, both for in-person and the online folks.
Yes, thanks so much for that great intro, and we're really happy that this all worked out.
Yeah,
nice.
Excellent. So I am Tyler Boyle, and
I'm Julia Mars, and maybe I will sit and let you take this first part, and then I'll come back
sure,
up here.
yeah. So we're gonna talk about two different R&D projects that we have at NIST, but it all falls under the NIST Greenhouse Gas Measurements Program, who's kind of that's who employs us, and that's the program. And so we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the overview. So you all interact with NIST every day, whether you know it or whether you don't know it. Who here has ever purchased a pint of ice cream before? Yeah, a lot of hands. I just bought one last week. So you can thank NIST for making sure that that pint of ice cream is actually a pint and that you're not getting shortchanged by any measurement. So NIST, we are the National Metrology Agency for the United States. So we handle weights, we handle measures. The gallon of gas that you pump with your car or at the pump for your car, somewhat tied back to us. We do weights, we do measures. We also do standards, various network standards, engineering standards, et cetera. So today I'm going to talk about or give a brief overview of the NIST Greenhouse Gas Measurements Program. So our program's goal is to develop internationally recognized measurements and standards enabling reliable, accurate, traceable, and spatio-temporally resolved greenhouse gas emission data to support effective mitigation actions and science-based policy decisions. That's a mouthful. But essentially what we're focusing on is the accurate measurement of greenhouse gases, whether it's with concentration data, whether it's the emissions that we are creating and using SIF and other tools to measure it. So we are kind of break down into three fundamental groups: the fundamental metrology, the applied metrology, and the standardization and stakeholder outreach. When I say metrology, I mean measurement sciences. So we are the measurement people. So why do we care? Why is there a NIST Greenhouse Gas Measurements Program? So we're all here, we're either at ESSEC, at NASA, at NOAA, or at another esteemed institution. We know that these urban populations can contribute up to around 70% of anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions. So we know this as the scientists. And the cities, the stakeholders, the counties, the states, they all know this too. And they want to make a difference. But in order to make a difference, they need these accurate and traceable measurements. So a way that a lot of people do this and get these measurements is through various measurement or various urban monitoring networks, or even some in more rural areas. So each star here represents a greenhouse gas measurement network in the United States with all different types of measurement processes for us to understand, to try and better provide data for all of our stakeholders so they can understand what exactly is going on. So we're with the NIST Greenhouse Gas Measurements Program. This is a very busy slide, and I apologize for that. But what we're going to talk about today is some of our more R&D aspects. So Julia is going to start off with the solar-induced fluorescence, the SIF measurements, and some of the R&D work that we're doing both on our campus and around the area, as well as my work, which is the mid-cost sensors, which I have a box over here, and we'll talk about that later. So without further ado, I'll introduce you to Julia, and she'll take it away.
All right, well, thanks, Tyler. And yeah, so I am Julia, and today I'm going to be discussing some work that I have been doing on biogenic carbon fluxes at an urban scale. So as a little bit of motivation for this work, mostly today I'm going to be talking about carbon uptake via photosynthesis and then re-emission to the atmosphere via respiration. And on the left, I'm reproducing a figure from the most recent global carbon budget, mostly to highlight that those fluxes are associated with really large uncertainties, sort of underlines the measurement challenge of trying to get accurate estimates of carbon fluxes from ecosystems that are frequently very structurally complex and heterogeneous, and also, varying both season to season and year to year. So there's a lot of complexity within that, but today I'm going to be focusing on one area, urban biogenic carbon fluxes, that frequently have been understudied and in some cases omitted from global carbon budgets, with the assumption that they might be small or negligible compared to other carbon fluxes globally. But some of the work that our group has been doing over the last several years has shown that it's really not the case. On the right there, the figure that I'm showing is a time series of carbon dioxide enhancements over Baltimore and Washington, D.C. from a tower network that our group has been operating. And you can see for some parts of the year, those enhancements in the urban area are quite significant compared to a rural background site. But in red, I'm highlighting periods of peak summer when there is the most photosynthesis from street trees and parks and lawns and everything else you might find in a city. You can see that that enhancement drops to zero, or in some cases even to a net uptake, because the activity of the urban biosphere equals, or in some cases exceeds, the magnitude of anthropogenic emissions in urban areas. So essentially what that's telling us is that if we want to have an accurate handle on what greenhouse gas emissions in cities are generally, we need to understand what the urban biosphere is doing. And that also ties into what Tyler just mentioned about being able to assess progress toward cities' emissions reductions targets. So, the way that I have been working on characterizing urban carbon fluxes kind of hits on 3 avenues of work that I'll touch on in this talk. So first off, I've been doing a lot of satellite remote sensing work and using satellite products to feed into models like the Vegetation, Photosynthesis, and Respiration model, VPRM. I've also been doing a lot of work out at some field sites that we've established on the NIST campus. Out there, we are also doing remote sensing measurements from proximal scales, so towers mostly, and also making in situ carbon flux measurements with a variety of instrumentation that I'll mention later. And I will mention also, just since it comes back up later in the talk, that those sites are tied into a couple of national monitoring networks, including the PhenoCam network of cameras that monitor vegetation phenology, as well as the Ameriflux network of eddy covariance flux towers. And then the final piece that I'll discuss toward the end of this talk is my work bringing some of that instrumentation from the field sites into the labs at NIST, where we maintain the national scales traceable to the International System of Units, or the SI. And so with that proximity to the field sites, we're lucky enough to be able to bring the instrumentation back into the lab frequently and get really low uncertainty calibrations on our instrumentation that then we can propagate to the measurements we make in the field. So I probably don't need to explain this to this audience, but when I say remote sensing of vegetation, I'm talking about optical remote sensing, so differential reflectance of vegetation and other materials on the Earth's surface that we can use to calculate things like reflectance-based vegetation indices. Specifically, the ones that I'm going to highlight here are EVI, a greenness index, and LSWI, so quantifying water content of both vegetation and soils. And those, along with some meteorological data, feed into the model I mentioned earlier, VPRM. This model was originally published back in 2008, and the basic structure of this model is very simple. It estimates net ecosystem exchange, or net carbon flux, as the sum of total carbon drawdown by vegetation, or GEE, and respiration from living things in the same area. So there's been a couple of iterations on VPRM since it was published. Across all of them, the GEE formulation stays pretty much the same. It's a light use efficiency model where we get information on incoming photosynthetically active radiation, or PAR, and then use EVI as an estimate of how much green vegetation there is on the surface to be absorbing that incoming PAR. We downscale for temperature stress, water stress, seasonality, and then that gives us the GEE estimate. On the respiration side, that's where the couple of changes to this model have come in. The original model was just a linear function of the temperature that we used to estimate respiration, but a couple of recent updates to this model have adapted it a little bit to make it better suited to urban areas. So the first is called Urban VPRM, which adds in some accounting for seasonality beyond just that temperature sensitivity, as well as some downscaling terms to take into account that in a lot of areas, in urban areas, there are impervious surfaces covering what would have been soils that would respire back to the atmosphere. Finally, I'll mention new VPRM, which is another model formulation published by a former member of our group, Sharon Gorgie, a couple of years back. And this made a couple of other modifications, including taking that temperature relationship to a nonlinear formulation that also involves soil moisture, and then incorporating some additional effects related to seasonality and temperature stress. So with all of this, Oh, I guess I should also mention, sorry about, forgot this slide, that all of this is happening on a basis that is specific to the dominant land cover at any given satellite pixel. So the way that this was done, for example, for that new VPRM was by pulling data from the National Land Cover Database and relating it to a large network of eddy covariance flux towers in this big domain you can see on the left. To calculate parameters that are optimized for the specific land cover that go into that model, as well as the other things I mentioned on the previous slide. So what I've been doing with this, I'm going to present one case study using one of these field sites on the NIST campus that I mentioned earlier. This one is called the Turf for the Urban Respiration Fraction, or TURF site, and this is a large turfgrass lawn. So a really ubiquitous land cover in urban areas and a highly productive one, but one that has often been left out of a lot of carbon flux modeling. So what we've been doing out there is running a couple of formulations of VPRM and comparing those estimates of NEE, GEE, and respiration to measurements that we're making with a couple of in situ sensors. So there's a flux tower out there providing us with NEE estimates for the footprint surrounding the flux tower. And then we also use what are called soil collars, so a little round plastic piece that is embedded in the soil and can be used as a mounting spot for a collar, or sorry, a chamber connected to a gas analyzer. We can take out, we've been doing this on approximately a monthly basis, and measure carbon fluxes directly from this lawn. So what I have been doing to compare all of these is using a couple of these VPRM formulations that I mentioned earlier. So that new VPRM that I'm running with the standard grassland parameters that were developed for it, as well as a new set developed specifically for urban lawns by a group out of Penn State, as well as that urban VPRM with a set of parameters that were originally developed for California grasslands. So potentially fairly different from the grasses that are out in a lawn in Maryland, but we wanted to give them a try and see how everything matches up. So what I'm showing here, the rows are those three different sets of parameterizations. The VPRM estimates are shown with the black points and lines, flux tower data from this same site in red, and all of the NEE measurements from the chambers in blue. And if you look, for the most part, the agreement is pretty good. We get a lot of overlap. There are some instances where there's some bias. For example, that California parameterization in the summer months looks like it may be a little bit off. But nonetheless, we generally are getting good agreement here. However, if we dig into sort of the component fluxes that go into this, the GEE and respiration, it's sort of a different story. So I'm going to focus on the respiration here and highlight that, where if we look at the match between our measurements from those soil collars and the model, we are grossly underestimating the amount of respiration happening at this site. And though I'm not showing it here, it's a similar story for the GEE, which suggests to us that though we're coming to a value that happens to match up well on the NEE side, it may not be for a good reason. It may just be coincidence. So this got us thinking about what we might be missing in our model formulation that we are underestimating with all of these different model parameterizations. And the thing that came to mind is the fact that this is a managed landscape and it gets mowed. So mower goes by, leaves a bunch of lawn clippings all over this area, and some of them are inside our chambers and also within the footprint of the flux tower. The model wasn't designed to handle that sort of thing and doesn't necessarily know anything about that. And so what we decided to do was take advantage of the fact that we have this camera out there as part of the PhenoCam network I mentioned earlier. It's out there taking pictures every 15 minutes. So I pulled the last couple of years of data and used an image segmentation package to find the days that the mower went by based on the mowing lines. As you can see, it does pretty well. It sees the mower going by. And with that information on the exact dates and times of mowing, we can then ask the question, does time since mowing help explain or correlate with any of the discrepancies that we're seeing in our models and measurements? And so that's what I'm showing here on the left. For at least those two parameterizations that are to the left and center of this plot, we do see a significant relationship between model data mismatch or model measurement mismatch and days since mowing. It's a little less clear for that California parameterization that wasn't performing as well, but for the other two, it seems like a fairly strong relationship. And then on the right, I'm also highlighting that if we look through all of the days in our study period, the majority of them are within 2 weeks of a mowing date. So this is an effect that's potentially impacting a lot of the data that we've been looking at in this study. And it seems like this is at least one driver of this mismatch that we're seeing here in this case study. I will end this portion of the talk on a little caveat that, as you might imagine or experience with your own lawn, as the temperature cools down at the end of the season, the grass grows more slowly and you don't have to mow as often. And that sort of confounding factor is not taken into account yet with any of this. That is one of the next steps for this work, is drawing that in, and then also looking for any structural things about VPRM that we might need to change in order to get better performance in these kinds of managed urban landscapes. So some of that might be adding some extra terms to the model, but we're also looking into potentially adding different data sources. And I'll return to that at the end of this talk, but I wanted to take a little detour before then to discuss a different project that I've been working on actually at our other field site on campus, which is looking at solar-induced chlorophyll fluorescence measurements. So for those of you who might not be familiar with solar-induced fluorescence, or SIF, this originates basically because any leaf out on a tree somewhere doesn't exactly get a choice in how much light is incident on the leaf at a given moment. So if we think of light heading toward a leaf, some gets reflected off the leaf, some is transmitted through the leaf, and what's absorbed by the chlorophyll is at least partially used up to power photosynthesis, but it's pretty common for a leaf to absorb more light than it can use up instantaneously. And so there are a couple of other mechanisms by which that extra energy can be dissipated back out to the environment before cell damage can occur. So the majority of that leaves as heat, but about 1 to 5% of a typical leaf's absorbed light will be re-radiated as fluorescence. Just this is a property that chlorophyll has. And because this fluorescence signal is tied directly into photosynthesis and photosynthetic rate, this signal has garnered a lot of attention in the remote sensing community as a potential way to monitor primary productivity of plants. So there have now been a number of SIF measuring satellites launched, mostly inspired by some early studies like the one that I am highlighting. They're showing that at the satellite scale, SIF is very strongly correlated with gross primary productivity, or GPP. If you look at that figure, you can see that one of those R-squareds is 0.99. So a very intriguing and very strong correlation here. This has also led to the proliferation of lots of SIF measuring systems at the tower scale and at field sites like the one that we have on the NIST campus. And we've been running a SIF system out there for a number of years. And a little while back, looking through some trends in our data that we were a little bit puzzled by, I ended up doing a meta-analysis of all of the literature that I could find on SIF retrievals from this sort of proximal scale, so towers, drones, etc. And what I found looking at those published values alongside any papers that were also measuring GPP from the same site is that those correlations are not as obvious or really present across the literature, as you can see there, with a much wider scatter of these points and no significant correlations. To dwell a little longer on this meta-analysis, the other thing that I noticed going through all of these papers is that you just look at the mean value for what SIF from healthy vegetation should look like. That's what I'm showing in the histogram there on the left. They are really all over the board. These values span 3 orders of magnitude. So even breaking that down, which I'm showing on the left, or rather on the right, by season and vegetation type, you still, even with these things that might explain some of that variability, see a really, really wide range, more like 2 orders of magnitude, in what's considered a typical SIF retrieval. So a real lack of consensus across the literature. And the final thing that I'll point out from this previous meta-analysis is that if you read these papers, everyone is configuring their systems fairly differently and trying out different methodologies to calibrate these systems. So what I'm going to show next is a very NIST-y sort of investigation into the different components that are used in these systems and the types of error and uncertainty that they may contribute to a final retrieved SIF value. So to give you an idea of how these systems are often set up, I'm going to highlight the one that we've been using at our field site for the last couple of years. We've nicknamed it Cameron. And the way this works is we, down at the bottom, have a temperature-controlled box with a couple of spectrometers in it. Those are connected together with a fiber optic cable that then goes to a longer fiber optic cable, goes out of the building and up to the roof, where we have those spectrometers connected up to a lens tube, or basically a small telescope, inside a weatherproof box with a window. We mount that whole thing on what's basically just a fancy security camera because we wanted to take advantage of their nice pointing software. So we can point the spectrometers and this camera around to different areas of vegetation. I'll also mention that to do this SIF retrieval, you need spectra both from the vegetation and from the sky to get a sense for the incoming light environment. So this can also, as you see in the picture, rotate up and look through a piece of diffusive white glass called a cosine corrector. So that's sort of all of the pieces that play into a system like this. What I've been doing is bringing this system, and actually we now have 3 of them, into the lab, and both putting traceable scales onto these to get our data into radiometric units, but also examining each of these hardware components individually, swapping them among systems, removing them individually to see what effect they have on the measured signal, and also doing some system disassembly and reassembly, as is common in deploying things in a field environment. Last thing I'll highlight is that we've also been looking into a lot of the environmental effects and atmospheric corrections that we need to do when we use these systems in the field. So after repeating this on the 3 systems that we have several times over, we have enough data to generate uncertainty and error distributions associated with all of the different components in this system. And I've fed those into a Monte Carlo uncertainty simulation. The methods for that basically being that you give the simulation one set of sample data, much like we would collect in the field. And that is taken as true for the purpose of the simulation. And then iterate a bunch of times, highlighting each of these hardware components individually, drawing from those associated uncertainty and error distributions, and seeing what effect each of these components has on the final retrieved SIF value. So to show you what some of the results from this look like, in all of these cases, the black dotted line is that true value, or what we're taking as true for the purpose of this simulation. And then the colored lines and error ribbons are the effects of these individual components that we're looking at. So to walk you through this a little bit, you can see at the top, there's a bunch of components that we tested that don't have a huge effect on the final SIF retrieval value. The retrieval is not overly sensitive to our choices on which components to use there. However, there are others where we see both large errors and large uncertainties associated, so the colored line sitting quite far from that true value, and in some cases, those error ribbons being quite large as well. Here at the bottom, I'll highlight that the largest single effect that we saw from anything we've tested here is the effects of that atmospheric correction. If we had failed to apply it, we would actually get nonsensical negative values. So clearly very important that we are applying this and applying it correctly in order to return to our true value. But sort of the punchline here is that if we run this simulation exactly as we do in the field and apply all of our corrections, we return to that true value within a 1% margin of error. So we feel really good about the system that we're using, the corrections and calibrations that we've applied, and our ability to measure SIF in this field setting. However, as we looked through the literature before, we saw that that was not equal across every paper that's been out there, and that this is likely to be at least one contributing factor that might explain why we're seeing these big discrepancies in SIF magnitude and in SIF GPP relationships across scales. So we think it's very important for this community to discuss this a little bit more and try and get some more standardized methodologies out there. But to wrap up, I did want to return to that idea of the modeling work. One of the plans for the future of our VPRM work is to incorporate SIF data in place of the EVI that we have been using and try and reformulate that model. And now that we have everything working at our field site, the plan is to do some case studies, much like the one that I showed out at the turfgrass site, using those in situ SIF and carbon flux measurements as model validation so that we can hopefully contribute to an improved next generation of carbon flux models for urban areas. And with that, I think we said we were going to do some Q&A in between, so I'd be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, so if anyone online has any questions, I'm going to ask you to please type them in the chat. And if anyone in person has any questions, just wave at me.
Thanks for a very nice talk. When you're looking at the urban productivity, you focused on the respiration end of it. And I wondered if you looked at variabilities in how plots were irrigated and things like that, and how that affected the other side of things.
Yes. So it's funny you should say that. So this particular lawn isn't irrigated or fertilized. It's sort of a very lightly managed lawn. But out at our other field site, we have been testing some irrigation and fertilization effects. We actually did a thing where we ripped out some of the regular lawn that was there and is just mowed and replaced it with some sod from a sod farm, and have been irrigating and fertilizing it and monitoring it actually with our SIF system. So the analysis is still in progress on those, but that is definitely an area of interest.
An online question really quick. Hi, can you explain collar measured fluxes a little more? How was this done?
Yes. So I'm realizing I don't have a photo of it, but the way that it works is you take, actually, it's just a piece of PVC pipe cut maybe 3 or 4 inches thick, hammer that into the ground, and then it provides a nice base for a couple of what we call chambers. There's basically just a dome with a gasket that fits right on top of that collar. And we actually use 2, one transparent one, so you're getting light in just as you would be from regular sunlight, to measure NEE. So that collar is hooked up by some tubing, or the chamber rather is hooked up through some tubing that goes to a gas analyzer. We can measure both with light and then swap out an opaque dome so that we're just measuring respiration. So no light's coming in to do photosynthesis. So with that, we can get NEE and respiration measured directly, and then the difference is that GEE. So that's how we're doing those.
Thank you.
Actually, my question is kind of similar to the first one. I was wondering, or first of all, I wanted to comment. I thought it was really interesting how the phenocam could detect like the length of the grass. I thought that was really neat.
Yeah, I was really happy that the mowing lines showed up so clearly on there. It was very convenient for us.
Also, so I was wondering, does the modeling for lawns or turf account for, well, how in many cases the clippings are not composted on site, but they're like hauled away by like city collection or whatever?
Yeah, so at the moment, no, though it would be interesting to repeat this sort of thing on a lawn that did have that and see if we still have a mismatch this extreme, given that we're hypothesizing that the mowing and leaving the clippings is contributing there. So it would be great to try and do this on another differently managed lawn site.
I see. Thanks.
Also, I have a quick question for follow-up. So how the site you select and how representative to the overall kind of the vegetation in the US, I guess?
Yeah, so I would say that turfgrass lawn is fairly typical of at least this part of the country. I believe it's mostly Maryland fescue. I am not a grass expert though, so don't quote me on that. But I think, generally that's a grass seed species that you could buy around here and a lot of people are using in their lawns. The forest where we're making those SIF measurements that I mentioned is predominantly a tulip poplar and maple forest, which is also pretty typical from around here. And I should have mentioned it's a remnant stand of forest from when the NIST campus used to be farmland. So it's what was growing around here for a while.
There was one follow-up question, but I want to make sure we have time for Tyler's presentation. So actually 2 more. Okay, so those 2, and then we'll do Tyler's. This was a follow-up question to the online question that I just asked. Not sure why we'd expect SIF to be well correlated with other parameters, as it is in excess over what the plants need.
Yes, so that's a great question. Those are pathways that, if you're in a, for example, light limited environment, would be competing for photons, but in a well illuminated environment like what a lot of the satellite platforms are seeing, you're essentially seeing plants in a regime where they have plenty of light for both photosynthesis and some excess that's getting dissipated as fluorescence. So in some cases, I think the satellite measurements may be that well correlated simply because that's a fact of the satellite viewing, needs to be without clouds. It's always during the day for a sun-synchronous satellite. But those, that's a great question. There are some non-linearities in that relationship that are probably more prominent at the tower scale than at the satellite scale.
Thank you. So there was one more online question, and then I want to make sure we have time. How was progress on an airborne version for larger footprint?
Oh, yeah, of the SIF system, does it say?
Russ, do you want to?
Yeah.
I think you can unmute yourself.
Yes, yeah, of the SIF system, yeah.
So I know some aircraft, I know that Goddard, actually, the G-Light platform that runs out of Goddard has an airborne SIF sensor. We have not tried out putting anything on a drone or plane with this particular system, though it would be cool to see, and you could get a different vantage point over the forest than, from a nearby building.
Great idea.
Okay. I want to make sure we have time for Tyler. So you do have another question, Julia, but I can hand you my laptop if you want to answer it via chat.
Just do, yeah, I don't want to cut into Tyler's time.
Okay, cool. Go ahead.
Well, hi, everyone. Thanks for, having me, and I'm excited to follow on some of the cool work that Julia has been working on. So we're gonna change paths a little bit, and we're gonna focus primarily on CO2 concentration measurements. But we're gonna do so using a newer type of sensing technology or newer type of sensors that are out on the market, using what we're gonna call low and mid-cost sensors. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But why do we care about these concentrations themselves? Well, we're all here at ESSEC, we all have affiliations. We all know what this figure represents. It's the Keeling curve. We all know that CO2 concentrations have been building up in the atmosphere, that they can contribute to climate change. And we also know that by measuring these concentrations over long periods of time, it allows us to monitor emissions. It allows us to understand what is going on. But it's very important that if we're creating these long-term records, or if we're measuring these concentrations at all, they need to be very accurate, and they also need to be traceable. We need to be able to understand that the measurements taken in 1960 are traceable to, what we take in 2010 or 2020. We need to make sure that all of our measurements can relate together. And so that's kind of where we're coming into play with it as the NIST Greenhouse Gas Measurements Program. So a lot of groups, a lot of organizations, they deploy these types of in situ carbon dioxide monitoring networks or systems in networks across the United States. And I showed a slide at the very beginning about it. And a lot of them are called cavity ring down spectrometers. And these are very accurate instruments. They can measure CO2 within 1/10 of a ppm. If we look up on the Keeling curve, we can see that CO2 can vary yearly by about 6 ppm. So we need a very small scale to see what's going on. But this comes at a cost. These CRDS instruments are quite expensive. They can cost upwards of $100,000, and they can be quite expensive to maintain and to maintain a network of them. And so to kind of combat that, to try and come up with another approach for how we can measure these concentrations, we started leveraging these low and mid-cost sensors. And essentially, these are indoor air quality sensors that have come out on the market over the past 10 or 15 years. And low cost, anywhere between $15 to $100, going all the way up from $100 to $2,000. So sensors that are a fraction of the cost of these traditional cavity ring down spectrometers. But there are challenges. These sensors weren't designed to do what we want them to do. They're a lot less accurate and precise than the CRDS measurements. We need them to measure at around a 1 to 2 ppm uncertainty for us to see what's going on. And it's easier to see it at an urban scale, but in kind of like a more rural scale, we really need to have that high accuracy. These sensors are also susceptible to what we're going to call temporal drift. And so these concentration measurements, and you'll see that on my later slides, they can drift from these sensors. And so we need to be able to calibrate them and correct for them in order to use this data. And then they're a lot less reliable than the CRDS systems. These are standalone sensors. You buy these from the manufacturer. So the CRDS is a fully functioning system that you can buy from a manufacturer. These need some sort of housing enclosure and architecture to support them. But despite all of this, despite these challenges, there has been research that shows when we combine measurements from these types of sensors alongside those from our CRDS and these kind of what we call hybrid networks, it can be beneficial to helping us understand and measure CO2 concentrations, which can in turn allow us to better estimate emissions. So out of that, our mid-cost sensors project was born. So this is a picture right here. Actually, this is from the same site from where Julia has some of the instrumentation for the forest project. This is one of our boxes. But the idea is that we want to optimize the sensor performance of these guys through calibration and data processing. We also want to have a robust system that can measure CO2 and can be tweaked in the future. That, say, if we want to add air quality, we want to add other atmospheric constituents, we can do that. And our end goal is to deploy around 50 of these devices, which are self-calibrating, out in the field within the Northeast corridor. So I'll talk a little bit about this. And for those who are in the room, I encourage you, I brought a box with me today, and I'd be happy to show you the hardware and what it actually looks like. But this is kind of our station kind of as an overview. This is the generation 3. This is the third version. We have a 4th generation that I'll show pictures of next. But the idea is that we wanted a robust and modular system that could grow as our sensing needs grow. So it's powered by a Raspberry Pi. And right now, this system measures CO2, temperature, pressure, and relative humidity. And it takes a measurement every 3 seconds. All of those measurements are done on our sensor daughter board. And the idea is that as our system changes, as new sensors come on the market, if we want to add them into our system, all we have to do is replace this sensor daughter board. We don't have to replace the whole motherboard. We don't have to redo all the architecture. So I digressed on that, but the idea is that we collect these measurements from this modular design every 1 minute, and then we are running calibrations in the field every 12 hours with reference gases. So there are 2 bottles that go out with this station that we're running a 400 and a 600 ppm calibration, so we can get this traceability, so we can get this accuracy that we need. We're running it on open source hardware using a Raspberry Pi and other commercially available sensors, various things from Adafruit, and I'll show you in a moment. But the idea, is that the system is 2 boxes. I brought part 1, that's part 1, that's sitting over there. But the second box is just a cal box with cylinders in it. So what does it look like for the folks online? The idea is that we have this modular system. You can see there are 2 green boards. There is the motherboard, you can see, which has the fan. And then there's the daughter board, which has 3 of the sensors. 2 of them have a gray cap on them. And the idea is that we have this robust, scalable system that has a bottom panel so we can easily access it and we can interface with it while it's in the field. This one has a cellular hotspot. It's actually sitting up onto the roof of the NOAA building right now collecting data, this exact one that I took pictures of. It has valves in it so we can run calibrations in real time. It has a toggle valve so we can determine which sensor we want to calibrate. And in the end, we wanted our system to be lower cost. The CRDS can cost anywhere from 60 to 100K, even more. Our station box alone, so this one box, costs around 3,500. We're looking at around 9,000 for the whole system, and that's including all of the gas cylinders with calibration gas, with the regulators, with the calibration box, and the architecture and infrastructure to mount it on the roof. So we're under 10K with this, and our estimated yearly cost to keep these operational is mainly tied back to the reference gas that we needed to fill the cylinders, and we're at around 1 to 3K. So this is a significantly cheaper platform for us to measure greenhouse gas, to measure carbon dioxide. So let's talk about how we're getting this measurement, how we're getting these measurements from the sensors to a place where we can actually process them. And so just as I wanted our system to be scalable with hardware, I want it to be scalable on the software side. If one of our sensors goes down, I don't want the whole system to shut down because we're relying on these measurements. We're relying on all of these measurements in real time. And we also wanted it to be easy to add a new sensor to it in real time without disrupting a huge monolithic program that causes the station to go down. So I came up with this architecture, and the idea is that we have one custom Python script that is used to read the sensor, and we have 3 standardized shell and Python scripts that are used to process this data and to query it and to send it off as needed. So let's go through an example. The K96, which is the sensor up there, we have a Python program called K96.py, which reads the sensor every 3 seconds. From there, this data is pushed off to a standardized script and dumped into something called an in-memory database called Redis. And the idea is that this is a scratch pad. All these measurements just get repeatedly added into Redis, and we never have to worry about it overwriting. From there, we have a script, a standardized script that's called every 1 minute, and it grabs all of these measurements from the past minute, and it calculates out the average and the standard deviation for them. And it spits them out into something called a JSON packet, which is an easy to read, human readable packet. This is an example I have up here. And then this JSON packet gets sent through to AWS IoT Core to our cloud-based architecture, which we then use to process and apply calibrations in real time. I won't talk too much about the architecture, but I'm happy to chat afterwards about it. But the idea is we needed a robust and flexible network architecture to support all of these sensors, whether we're using them for CO2, whether we're using them for urban heat island, whether we're doing urban measurements or global measurements. We want to make sure that our architecture can handle a large number of stations and can easily add stations to it as needed. So the idea is that our stations send off this packet. It's called through a protocol called MQTT, and it gets sent off to AWS IoT Core, which is our broker. And from there, the data ping pongs back and forth. We have this thing called Lambda, which is a serverless compute function that AWS offers. And the data goes back and forth and is processed and validated and calibrated in real time. And from there, the data gets sent off to our databases, or the data gets sent off to our dashboard, or if there is an error, it sends a notification directly to me via email. And something else that we really needed was a way that we can remote into these devices without having to open up ports on the firewall. Because some of these are on host networks. We have one on the Atlantic building, and we don't want to ask UMD to open up a port for us, which could cause all kinds of security issues. So we use AWS Systems Manager for us to remotely log into these stations and change calibration procedures or just run simple diagnostics. This is kind of what I want to focus on because as scientists, we care about making this data accurate. And essentially, this device, this box, sends out a packet to an MQTT topic, which is essentially the address. And the idea is that this packet, both with the topic and with the packet itself, which has metadata in it, is being used to route our data through the system and to apply the appropriate calibrations and send it to the right database. So if we start off, we start off with this raw packet here, and we can see that we have this raw packet state. This is coming right from the station. What happens is we publish this to, DT, raw, NIST, GBERG, all of this metadata is in here, station ID. We publish this and it goes into AWS and it reaches this compute function, this message raw. And what this does is it looks at the message and goes, okay, do we have all of the parameters that we're supposed to have? If it's a CO2 sensor, we need CO2, temperature, pressure, humidity. Are these measurements what we expect them to be? Is RH negative? And it verifies and validates this message and lets us know if there is an error. So let's say the data is good. It changes the topic state to valid, and it sends it off to this Lambda. Now, what this Lambda does is it's looking at the packet, at the metadata, and if there is a calibration or metric in this data packet, it calls the appropriate calibration to run it in real time. So we're doing this with our CO2 sensors, which I'll talk about next. And then once this is done, the data gets sent through. It goes to 3 places. We'll just ignore that because that's for system stats. Gets sent off to our CloudWatch dashboard, which we use to visualize all of our data in real time. And then it gets an archive packet state, where it goes to 2 places. We have this Lambda here looks at a metric that is in the data packet that tells it what database does it go to. And from there, it routes it to DynamoDB, which is a NoSQL database that we use. We're also dumping everything into cold storage using S3. So all of our data is available. It's in the cloud. It's processed in the cloud. But we wanted an architecture that could be used to validate and calibrate all of this in real time. Quick example. So this message raw, which is this Lambda function, is looking at this data packet, and it's looking to see if somebody injected bad data on it, or it's looking to see if a sensor failed. And in this case, the sensor failed. I don't think we're supposed to have negative CO2, and I know we're not supposed to have negative RH. So there's something wrong with the sensor. So what happens is this packet comes in as a raw packet into this message raw. And what it does is it looks at all of these parameters and goes, this is out of scope and that is out of scope. And it changes the packet state to error. And from there, we have an alarm that sits there and it waits and it watches. And so when we have 5 messages or 5 error messages that occur in 5 minutes, it triggers an alarm and it sends an email saying, sensor number 1 on box number 3 has failed. And from there, I go out and I have to replace it. So there is still a human aspect in it, but it's a way for me to detect a system. And this is important if we have a huge number of stations out in the field and we need this data in real time. We need to know when a system's down so we can allocate our resources to fix it. So let's talk a little bit about the measurements themselves. I showed you what the measurements are not supposed to look like, so I'll show you what they look like when we calibrate them, or this is right before we calibrate them. So the idea is that, I mentioned this, these lower and mid-cost sensors, they're great, but they're not designed for this application, and they need some data processing and some calibrations to them, and that's kind of where we're coming into play. So 2 figures here. This figure here is showing a time series with the purple, which is our CRDS that is deployed outside, and then our 3 K96s, which are our mid-cost sensors. And if we look at them, you can see that there is quite a large difference between them. And in this difference plot, you can see it as well. If we look at sensor number 3, we can also see that there is this temporal drift where we're getting further away from our truth, which is the CRDS. And when we look at the table, we can see that these stats are not usable for us to do what we want to do. There's been a lot of different research. Some of it Corey Martin did. There's a group at LSCE that's working on this. In Europe, there are a lot of groups. But what they determined is that these sensors are susceptible to P and T impacts, so temperature and pressure. And so that kind of got us started on our own calibration sequence for us to profile these sensors and get them to measure or correct out some of these dependencies in them. So we came up with essentially a 3-step process. The first step is we use what this is called as an environmental chamber to simulate out the various weather conditions that these stations might be exposed to in the field. And so we use this environmental chamber alongside a CRDS for us to create a multiple linear regression and MLR correction coefficients, unique ones for each and every sensor. From there, we take these sensors and we correct out the temporal drift using these in-field reference gas standards. So the 400 and 600 ppm gas cylinders. And we do this in the field. And then we average these sensors together to create, to kind of remove some of the dependencies as each sensor performs slightly different. But the idea is that this MLR, we do this in the very beginning when we first get the sensors, and then we deploy them outside and we assign these coefficients to them. So what happens when we do this? And in this case, this P and T correction is done in real time. Every minute, a measurement comes in. So if we look at it, we can see that this difference is largely gone. We are not 100 ppm off from our CRDS reference instrument, but we can still see that there is this temporal drift, and especially with sensor 3. And so that's why we need the reference gases. When we apply the reference gases, you can see that our RMSEs and standard deviations have drastically decreased. We can see that our 3 sensors follow the CRDS pretty well. We can still see some noise in there. And if we look closely, let's look at this date, which is, I don't know, April 10th. We can see that 2 of our sensors, so sensors 1 and 2, are reading higher than average or higher than the CRDS, and sensor 3 is reading lower than the CRDS. And this got me thinking that, okay, there are discrepancies with each of these sensors. What happens if we average them together to try and remove some of these discrepancies? And if we do that, we're able to reduce the standard deviation in the RMSE down to close to a ppm. And so just by averaging 3 of these sensors, these redundant sensors in our system, we're able to get close to this 1 ppm measurement that we have been desiring for uncertainty. And now this changes based on the sensors. I've seen sensor pairings where we've been able to get them down to 0.97 ppm for RMSE. So it really depends on each of the sensors. Each sensor performs a little bit differently, which is why each one needs its own correction coefficients. But in the end, we're able to get a highly accurate measurement from sensors that are only $500 a piece. So the key takeaways and what are our next steps? So our correction technique worked. We're able to reduce this uncertainty down to a measurement or to a level that we can use using traceable standards, using measurement techniques, using real-time calibration. We're able to do this. So we're able to get to this 1 ppm that we've been wanting. And then we did design a system that's scalable. Right now, our goal was to use this for urban measurements, but that may change. So our system can be easily scaled up. We're deploying more, or we're in the process of building 15 new stations right now. And the idea is that our hardware and our software and our architecture can all grow as we need it to. So as I said, our next step, we have, we're beginning the assembly of 15 new Gen 4 stations. And we're working with our colleagues at the Greenhouse Gas Center and NOAA to help work to purchase these and to deploy them. We're working with our local stakeholders to try and scale up our network. Our goal is to have 5 additional stations out by the end of the year. And then we're continuing to upgrade and evolve our architecture based on what we find that works and what needs to be tweaked. And I'll just leave it off at this. Here's a photo. So we have 4 sites right now. 2 are operational. 1 is offline and 1 is waiting to be repaired, henceforth why I have a box here today. So this one is right across the street at the NOAA rooftop, and you can see there, I'll do the mouse for those online. Here is our station box here. Here is our calibration box. And we have a radiation shield so we can do calibrated temp measurements. And then myself and my intern, Katie Lehman, and we're on the rooftop of the Atlantic building at UMD. And you can see our station is right up there. In this case, our gas cylinders are inside of the measurement hut. And then this is the dashboard. This is a screenshot I took this morning from our real-time measurements. And something else to note is that we co-located our NOAA deployment with a CRDS for the past couple months. And so I'm in the process of analyzing that data now, and I'm excited to see how this performs realistically in the field. And with that, I want to say thank you and happy to answer questions.
So we can have a same deal. If you have any online questions, please either type them in the chat or go ahead and raise your hand and I can just cue you just so I know that you want to ask a question. We do have an online question. Any plans to try to use these at Flux Tower at NIST turf field site?
We have been in talk with that, with David Allen and Julia a little bit about that. I know they have a couple of lower cost arable CO2 sensors there. Right now, our plans were mostly to do urban, but I suspect we might try and move towards doing that in the next couple months because we're going to have, 5 of these boxes come online, and at least to get them out in the field testing and collecting some valuable data while we figure out their final sites.
Thank you.
I was wondering who are some of the stakeholders for these measurements and or sensors, and then is there kind of an overall effort, overarching effort to, I guess, incorporate the measured data into like a flux inversion system, or would various stakeholders be using the data in their own ways?
Yeah, so stakeholder-wise, we're still figuring it out. I know there are a lot of localities that seem interested in having these measurements, not necessarily for the greenhouse gas side, but for our Gen 4s, which have AQ installed. And so they're really interested in the air quality in urban heat island. Various cities, we're talking about the city of Frederick and a couple of other people are interested more for that region or for that reason. And we're hoping that, it gives us a foot in the door so we can start to explain the benefit of having, these kinds of real-time greenhouse gas measurements. Could you repeat the second?
Regarding like
yeah.
flux inversions, incorporating those data.
So our goal, and we're working with NOAA on this, is to try and integrate this into a real-time inversion system. And these are going to be actually some of our sites that we're working to put them on are at the UrbanNet sites. So we have this high accuracy 3D winds and MET alongside. And so we're hoping that we can integrate this data alongside some of our tower data into kind of this urban emissions modeling real-time framework that NOAA is developing.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, just a quick question. So you mentioned that the stations calibrate every 12 hours.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just wondering how that was determined, not
Yeah,
longer or shorter.
yeah. So this was done a while ago, and we started off by deploying them at the forest site at NIST. And we started off calibrating them every 6 hours, just because we weren't entirely sure how well or how long these sensors held their drift. And so I did a series of analysis over a month. This was probably back in 2022, our very, very first deployment. And I found out that between, if you calibrate them every day, your uncertainties, in this case with our older correction algorithm, our uncertainties were about 2 to 3 ppm, which was a little higher than what we wanted. And as we scaled it down to 12, we were able to get to this like 1.8 ppm uncertainty from it. We tried every 6 hours as well, just to see, and it really didn't make any difference at that point. There's only so much we can do. And the goal is to try and reduce these cows, or the number of cows that we need to do in the field. And so I'm still trying to figure out if there are other ways that we can change the frequency, if we can run this at 18, kind of like at an 18-hour frequency. And that's kind of what we're hoping to find with this deployment on the NOAA rooftop.
We have 2 online questions, and then I'll go to you, and then I think we're losing people a little bit because we're at the hour, so apologies for that. So online question, how much of an effort is it to pack up, relocate, and switch on these sensor packages?
It takes about probably a half a day to a day to do it. The most strenuous part is actually the setup. So setting up the gas cylinders, bringing them up onto the roof, making sure that the power is working. So when we did the NOAA install, it took us maybe about 4 hours. UMD took a little bit longer just due to logistics. But the idea is that these things are ready to go once they leave the lab. It's just the physical assembly.
Thank you. Okay, last online question. Based on slide 27 or so, will the cost of each new installation be roughly $9,000 upfront plus $2,000 yearly?
I'm just going back. I know which one it is. There we go. It really depends on the site. So our UMD install, for example, was about $7K because we did not need an enclosure box to deploy on the roof. Our NOAA install was probably around $8K because they provided us with a stainless steel mount. And so the station costs can range anywhere depending, I would say between 6 to 9K, depending on how it's set up and the building logistics and what the building owner is willing to let us do. The estimated yearly cost, that's pretty close because we do need to refill these cylinders. We estimate twice a year. Unless we're able to fill these cylinders ourselves, we're looking at about $1,200 per fill for each set. So that number is pretty true. Plus, the FTE that it takes to coordinate the logistics.
Thank you, Taylor. A very informative presentation. I had a question. I worked previously with NIST measurements. I was working with CO2 measurements on site NEB, which was in the Baltimore. During the 2022, I noticed we have been for most of the year. I noticed missing data. I could say maybe 3 months or 4 months we had measurements, and for the rest of the year, there were missing data. I was wondering, does it have anything to do with what you showed in slide 31? What you were explaining, the 5 minutes alarm sensors. I was curious, what did make that issue of missing values of the measurements for that site and others also?
Yeah, so that's for an entirely different system. So that's with our cavity ring down spectrometers, which have quite a complicated system, but it very well could be. So there are times when there is a leak in the line because like NEB and all of those are going to be pulling from an inlet, maybe 100, 150 meters over. And so if there is missing data, it's likely that either the instrument itself had an issue, which these CRDSs can do. There could have been a line measurement. There could have been a pump failure. There are kind of a lot of different things. My colleague Anna Carrion works more on that data set. I'd be happy to put you in touch with her if you're curious. But it could be, it very well could be for all that we know or all that I know.
Well, thank you so much to both Tyler and Julia for giving us this great talk, and apologies to everyone for going a little bit late. Thank you for bearing with us on that. And with that, we can conclude our seminar. So again, thank you to everyone who showed up. Thank you to everyone online as well. And we will continue with our series in the fall. Have a great summer.